You are listening to episode 37 of the Lewis and Kyle Show with Eric Jorgensen.
Over the last few years, I've really shifted my belief from like, hey, you need to learn a thing before you do it, to like, go start doing it and you will be forced to learn it. And you will learn much better when you are in the context of trying to solve a specific problem than you will, trying to chart out your whole path and learn your way around every obstacle before you even get started. Like 5 years ago, I would have read about how to publish a book. And now I just have published a book, but it's not because I read about it 5 years ago. I don't even remember what I read 5 years ago.
Hello and welcome to the Lewis and Kyle Show. If this is your first time listening, welcome. Lewis and I are students at the University of Alabama, and we are on a journey to deconstruct success stories of interesting entrepreneurs, investors, and people making a big impact on their world. We're sharing what we learn in public from high-impact conversations with high-impact people. Today, we share with you our interview with Eric Jorgensen, author of the recently released Almanack, a collection of aggregated wisdom from the philosopher king of Silicon Valley, Naval Ravikant. Lewis, can you please just tell us a little bit more about Eric?
Eric Jorgensen is a product strategist at Zarly and also contributed to the blog Evergreen on Medium, which has educated and entertains more than 1 million readers about all topics related to business since 2014. And most recently, like you said, he published the Almanack of Naval Ravikant, a guide to wealth and happiness. In this conversation, we unpack some of the most important ideas from the book, most notably ethical wealth creation, and also applying many of the concepts to problems related to growing this podcast that Kyle and I have been sitting about. What does it mean to set and maintain a personal hourly rate? What does it mean to productize yourself? And we also ask Eric about the inspiration for this book, some of the other books he's read that inspired him to put this blog together and put this wisdom in one place. We talk about some other inspiring thinkers that he thinks are on the come up as well. And at the end, we have a fun discussion about sandwiches. It was a really fun conversation. I'm really glad that Eric came on with us, and I think y'all are going to enjoy listening to it. So with that, I'm just going to cut right to it. Eric, welcome to the Lewis and Kyle Show. We're super excited to chat with you today.
Happy to be here. Cheers.
Cheers. So for those in the audience who aren't familiar with you and your work, before we dive all the way into Naval, can you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Eric Jorgensen. I've been kind of in the startup tech world for the last 10 years or so, mostly working at Zarly. My kind of side projects have been a blog called Evergreen and a recent book called the Almanack of Naval Ravikant.
Awesome. Well, let's dive right into Naval then. Can you do a quick intro for him? Who's Naval, and when did you first encounter his work?
Yeah, Naval is kind of an icon in the Valley, and that's where I kind of first got introduced to him. Was like coming out of a startup weekend in Michigan when I was in college. I kind of met somebody who was actually in the Valley world for the first time, and they were like, hey, go read all of Venture Hacks and everything Naval has written, and go read everything Paul Graham has written. And I was like, all right, like these are the two kind of like lighthouses of the Valley. So that was kind of how I got introduced. And I've been following Naval since then. I listened to talks and followed him on Twitter and watched as he kind of built AngelList and added businesses onto that. And it's been really kind of cool to see not just him share more of his philosophy, but also kind of be able to apply that to dissecting how he has built what he's built. And so when you get kind of a big sample size of seeing someone's career over that length of time and seeing the philosophy get evolved as the businesses evolve, it's pretty cool and instructive, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you could write a similar almanac on Paul Graham as well. He's so influential in that world. But what books inspired you to write the Naval Almanac specifically? I know there's Seeking Wisdom and Poor Charlie's Almanac, but were there any, other than his tweets, was there anything else that kind of spurred you?
Yeah, there was a few, like the moment happened when I listened to his podcast with Shane Parrish, which was really, really incredible. And I think one of not only Shane's best podcasts, but Naval's best podcasts. And it's kind of perennially some of the most downloaded, and because it's just so dense with wisdom across a bunch of different areas. So that was really the catalyst for the book. But as I kind of got closer to publishing it, I was like looking back at like, how did this happen? The kind of Steve Jobs advice of like, it only makes sense looking back in the rearview mirror. Like you can't connect the dots going forward. And so I thought about some of the most high impact books on me have been Poor Charlie's Almanack, Seeking Wisdom, the Letters of Warren Buffett that Max Olson compiled. And there's a lot of books, especially it seems like around Munger and Buffett, that are actually compilations, and someone has taken, these existing raw materials and edited them into something new. Like that is Peter Bevelin's whole deal. He's publishing books based on Sherlock Holmes and on Buffett and on Munger and on Darwin, and they're incredible books. I mean, it's definitely like a niche for nerds over there, but it is like has been impactful for me. And so this kind of like subgenre of like curated collections existed to me in a way that it may not have for people who hadn't stumbled kind of into that world. And then the final kind of like keystone in that, I guess, was reading Principles. So Ray Dalio's book that was kind of the capstone of his career as he's turning to like more philanthropy and sharing his wisdom. He's like, hey, here's all this stuff that I've learned over my career. Here's how I ran my business. Here's how I made my decisions. And one of the things he says in that book is like, I wish other people had written their version of this book so that I could learn like in a transparent way when their career is closer to over, like, how did you do it? Why, what did you believe? What were your kind of guiding principles? And I started, that got my wheels turning on like, who else I wish had written Principles. And Naval was certainly on my list. And once I realized all the raw material was out there because of how prolific he is on Twitter and podcasts and things like that, I was like, well, maybe this is like a thing. And so that was kind of where the seed of the idea came from.
That's really interesting about how there's not that many books like Ray Dalio, how not that many people take the time to, at their end of their career, once they've reached that point of success, just like, let me explain all of it. So Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett so incredibly popular because they're the absolute best, or because, they're one of the few people that have actually taken the time to stop and reflect and distill everything into a clear thought?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the category of memoir is pretty filled out, and a lot of people write memoirs. Like Shoe Dog was an amazing business
Absolutely.
memoir, and Maverick, and like I've learned a lot from those. But Principles, I think, went really pretty far much farther into structured decision making and beliefs and principles, obviously, than a lot of the memoirs that are just kind of like, here's the story, here's what happened, that show you the decision points, but not really how someone's like decision making frameworks evolved and how they were very deliberate about what they did. And it may just be that not many people were as deliberate about cataloging their decision making process and things like that. But it is definitely it's a shifting genre and something that like I'm very interested in continuing to see get curated and built out. And I've learned a lot from Naval and from Ray Dalio and from Buffett and Munger, and it's exciting to see that this stuff can get created because it's a ton of work without the whole team and a few years of effort that like I'm sure Ray Dalio had to put into building Principles, and just not everyone's going to take the time to do that.
So one thing that I've thought about recently is like the value of advice to people. And like, do you think that if Naval had the Naval Almanack, that he would be Naval? You know what I mean? Like these people are writing their advice to people, but they didn't have that. And would they be where they're at if they were given the same advice? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the word advice is maybe loaded in that observation. I don't think Naval would call all of this advice. I think he would say like, here are the principles that I distilled that worked for me that I'm sharing. I'm not saying you should do them. I'm not saying you should follow, what I did. And he would never say that. In fact, he says directly the opposite. If you're trying to be someone else, you've already lost. You will never succeed at being someone else. But there are things that tend to be patterns that work, and there are things that are principles that once you observe can help you create your own success, right? So an idea like build or buy equity in a business, like, is that advice or is that a principle? Which is a little like, maybe it's semantics. But I think there's something interesting there. And I think there's something interesting about where the right level of abstraction is to say, this is something that does apply, even if, this applies if you were born with all the advantages, and it applies if you were born without any advantages. You still want to find a place of leverage. You still want to take personal accountability. That's not advice, maybe so much as like as a one-to-one situation specific, hey, you should do this, so much as it is like, hey, here's how the world works in a way that you may not have already understood, and understanding that may help you be more successful.
I think that's really valuable. And I think even Naval, he kind of talks about, I mean, if you put that timeline of Naval at the beginning of the book, where and you have it in the appendix at the end, I mean, he kind of outlined these principles, in like 2007, and then chose to follow them. So in a way, he did have them 10 years ago and then followed them. And then only recently, became the philosopher king, or whatever you want to call him, only recently decided to say, I'm going to share the operating system I've used for myself because it's battle tested. But let's actually dive in now into the book itself and some of Naval's key ideas before we keep referencing them, because we've all kind of dove in a little deep. But I want to start with kind of the same chronology used in the book about the how to get rich without getting lucky part of things. So could you quickly explain Naval's idea of ethical wealth creation and kind of the difference between that and villainizing wealth?
Yeah, there's a kind of a foundational idea here that some people get stopped on their journey to wealth before they really even get started, because they don't believe that it's possible to create wealth ethically. They believe that, like, in the history of it is hard to articulate the counter argument because it's quite obviously flawed to me, but they basically believe that all wealth transfer is wealth taken. And so that is to kind of omit all of the technological innovations that have taken place, but they basically believe that any wealthy person has like taken from someone else, not created wealth generally and captured some percentage of that. And so you have to really believe that the pie is growing all the time, and that any time you create, a profitable business that is exchanging with people on a voluntary basis, you're not only creating profit for yourself, offering something new, a new solution, but also that person is better off for having purchased your solution, or they wouldn't have done it. So not only is there profit captured by the business, but there's consumer surplus, which is what we call the kind of the gap between what the consumer paid and the benefit that they're getting. And that has to exist really for the consumer to want to transact. It's a kind of an economic principle there, but people without that worldview tend to villainize wealth and tend to believe that if they were to become wealthy, it would be because they did something immoral or did something evil, or if they are earning a profit, that they're taking it from someone. And that's not how I see the world. It's certainly not how Naval sees the world. I don't think it is the correct worldview, but it certainly is not one. It would be too shaky of a foundation. And I think anytime you were about to earn money, you would kind of come into this conflict where you thought you were doing something unethical and you wouldn't be able to do it. And I think maybe the most obvious example that people like to bring up in this case is like, what about J.K. Rowling? It's a little bit easier to villainize billionaires in commerce, but it's much harder to say like the world, like that J.K. Rowling stole something by creating a book that everyone wanted and paid for, and yeah, just creatively came up with this thing that so many people were excited to participate in. Who is worse off because Harry Potter exists? Like I know of no people. So that is like a mental test for like, she created something so valuable that a ton of people rewarded her for that and became better off as a result of it. So it's really important to kind of, if you have that within you, to kind of reconcile that and find your way out of it if you aspire to be wealthy and in line with your principles at the same time.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, kind of one of my big personal pet peeves, not to be, come at the defense of Jeff Bezos because everyone loves to attack him, but I kind of do like to come at his defense because, I'm continually fascinated at the number of things in this world that are awesome that only exist because of Jeff Bezos. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'm perfectly content with him having this astronomical amount of wealth when I just think about your book, right? And like Amazon Kindle and just the amount of different forms of knowledge and value he's democratized, I think justifies all of the wealth he's aggregated. Whether or not he deserves to keep the percentage of it that he's kept is sort of a secondary question. But the initial question of, there's no doubt that all of these things, authors like you and authors like Lee Lefevre, who we had on in the last episode we published, were able to distribute their books with, it basically created what Naval talks about, permissionless leverage. Like Jeff Bezos created a humongous, like immeasurably large way of getting permissionless leverage because of self-publishing. And that's just one of like all of Amazon. You know what I mean?
Yeah. This morning I checked a dashboard and like 200 people had purchased a book through Amazon. Amazon was printing that book, shipping that book to them, and like sending me the money. I didn't even do a thing, right? Like,
you just woke up.
I just woke up. It's incredible. And and there's a million, little ways that that's happening. AWS is supporting the whole internet. Amazon's now delivering packages. Like this is, Bezos is commonly, frequently attacked. And yeah, I find it to be a little bit of a tiresome argument because you're coming at such a different worldview that like everybody's just talking past each other. And I don't know what the right level to unpack is before you can kind of actually like see eye to eye and start understanding, and actually discussing the disagreement. It's just so far back that it's difficult to find.
Yeah, one thing that's hard for me to see is like, what specific knowledge did Jeff Bezos create in himself to be able to produce such massive results in the world? So my question is,
I almost have an answer for you there. Not to jump in.
Well, go for it, Lewis. What's up?
I'm just feeling inspired about Jeff Bezos today. I read the entire book, so I'm like deep, and I like read it so fast. So my brain is like trying to intersect all the ideas and connect them all at once. But I mean, there's so many unique insights that Jeff Bezos had to like, I mean, if we're talking like early Amazon, just first of all, he had the skill set of, building things and being a businessman and being very smart. And then this recognition of, I don't know if judgment counts as a form of specific knowledge, kind of reconciling all the terms, but he recognized that books being the most vast, right? The largest number of things in a similar category is books. And then recognizing the trend spotting of like the internet matters, all new wealth is going to be created because of the internet, and being able to combine those and execute on that, I feel like was his specific knowledge. But I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I just felt like I was just feeling inspired.
I was kind of trying to tie in the before and the after to get kind of a definition of specific knowledge in order to lead into the next question, which is, what can we ask ourselves to be able to develop our sense of what our specific knowledge area needs to be?
Yeah, I don't think we need to have a specific, like it is hard to create that category before you understand yourself. And so it doesn't start with like, what does the world need? It starts with, what do you have and what are you interested in? So the questions I think are like totally the right place to start. So the questions that you would ask yourself or really ask people around you, like, I think that is almost a shortcut. Self-examination is much harder than it's harder to see yourself sometimes and see the patterns that you lose sight of. So some of the people that I have kind of worked with already on this found success in finding their specific knowledge by talking to parents or people who were around them, siblings, people who were around them when they were younger, and so like, what were the things that you did when you had free time that you found hours and hours just like you lost yourself in? That's a kind of an early one to see, like, what were your emerging skills? What were your emerging interests? I've always been, much more words than numbers, or like mechanically inclined particularly. So like when I was 12, I was trying to like sit down and write novels about like elves, and they were terrible, but like I was at least experimenting with words. Right. On the kind of like, as you get closer to today, you might look at maybe in the workplace, like, what are the things that you get asked for? Do you get asked to kind of proofread and edit stuff? Do you get asked to create first drafts? Do you get asked to be present in meetings? Do you get asked to go with someone to meet with a client? Do you get asked to smooth things over when someone's angry? Do you get asked to step aside? Like, what are the things that people recognize in you that when they need your help, they come to you for? That's a pretty common like way to discover things. But it's not just what you're good at, it's also what you're interested in and what you enjoy doing. So the stuff that you do on nights, the stuff that you do on weekends, the people that you choose to hang out with, what you choose to talk to them about, can all kind of be clues to help you unpack that specific knowledge.
Can you contextualize that in terms of obsession, kind of the way Naval talks about the importance of how you will lose if that's not the case?
Yeah, I think, we are increasingly in kind of a winner take all world. And the people who, this is where you get into the role of hard work. Like, hard work is important. And if you are trying to compete with someone directly, like, hard work matters a lot. And so if you are doing something that you find deeply fulfilling and are already obsessed with, to use your word, like, you are going to naturally win at that thing when someone else feels like when it's hard for them to do each incremental task because they're using up, their willpower store to get through it. And somebody else is just like happily chugging along because like that's what they love to do and they would choose to do it. A story that not many people know is like how Craigslist got started. And really like part of the reason that it won the early internet before there was even like a race for the internet is just that like Craig Newmark fucking loved responding to customer support requests. And like, that's how he built that whole thing. Like it was a basic website at a time when the web was very basic. And so like the fast load speed was a big advantage, and it was very simple. So people who weren't used to like fancy graphics and stuff could use it. But also Craig Newmark would happily reply to 500 customers every single day and just help them find the thing or help them putz through it. And he's not like a super type A aggressive tech entrepreneur guy. He wasn't trying to build a huge business. He just really wanted to like help people on the internet and found fulfillment doing this kind of like rote task, and was like interpersonal but introverted. So like doing it through email really worked for him. And it just like reps of things that helped build that business. And that was a thing that would have been monumentally difficult for anybody else to do. They probably would have tried to find a way around it instead of just enjoyed the task and gotten through it and seen the prize that comes on the other side.
Yeah, and then, he just on the back end had network effects, all those things, like actually building the engine on the exponential scale kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, and I don't think that was, I think he probably started Craigslist before it was clear what it would become, and didn't necessarily know, I don't think the term network effects existed, or certainly was like as well understood as it is today when he started it. But it's an incredible business. I mean, it's one of the highest revenue per employee businesses ever, and is still kind of maintaining its moat despite Facebook Marketplace and eBay and all of this other stuff that has popped up. And it's a remarkable thing.
It really is. It's crazy to go on there and look at Craigslist and be like, this does not seem like it should exist today and be this big of a thing. But yeah. You've written a lot on your Medium blog and on Evergreen about network effects. But one contradiction that I kind of noticed is that like in Naval's How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky thread, he talks about you shouldn't study business, like not in school. You shouldn't read business magazines, but you write about business concepts on Evergreen. So how do you think about that?
I wish I'd had this book when I was 17, because I would have chosen a different major, for one. I think it's an interesting, I'm going to maybe like try to cop out through the like thread the needle here, but I think that there's a difference between studying, like he says there is no skill called business. And I think that that's right. I think that there are many kind of micro skills within business that you can really excel at and that are useful pieces of it, right? So like you can become really, really proficient at accounting, and like that will help you speak the language of a business. You can become really quite good at sales. You can become really good at building a team. You can become really good at, growth marketing. And all of those things are, maybe those are more specific skills that all help you build a business, but they are not, I always interpret it to say, like, if you just study business, that doesn't mean that you can build one necessarily. And the lessons of Silicon Valley are usually that people who are really obsessed with a specific topic or a specific technology end up building great businesses because of their obsession with that business or that technology, right? So like Brian Armstrong, maybe like obsessed with cryptocurrency and studied it and was an early adopter of it and tried all of these new things. And like, because of that, saw the opportunity for Coinbase and started building Coinbase. But he didn't start Coinbase because he had the greatest business mind in the world. Counter argument to that would be like Warren Buffett, right? Like Warren Buffett, maybe more than anybody else, has the skill of business, but he has the skill of accounting, analyzing, like valuation. And so it's a question of like how much you subdivide those. The thing that I took from Naval, and like have learned it later in life, certainly than I maybe could have, but with like, you don't study business as a whole. You try to like niche down and find the application of business. And studying businesses has always been interesting to me, and like looking across all of those things. But I, for a long time, made the mistake of thinking that if I just studied across all of those things, it would make me better at starting one or would lead me to it. And I don't think that that is true anymore. And I don't think I'm over the last few years, I've really shifted my belief from like, hey, you need to learn a thing before you do it, to like, go start doing it and you will be forced to learn it. And you will learn much better when you are in the context of trying to solve a specific problem than you will, trying to chart out your whole path and learn your way around every obstacle before you even get started. Like 5 years ago, I would have read about how to publish a book, and now I just have published a book, but it's not because I read about it 5 years ago. I don't even remember what I read 5 years ago. That all that was an indication to me that like maybe I was interested in doing that in the future, but that knowledge was gone. Like there was no way to apply it in that moment. It was completely irrelevant. And 5 years later, I did something totally different, but I learned my way over and through those obstacles as they came up because I was committed to finishing this project. And so that is like, that is how I see that quote now. It is not like, don't study business because you need to know all of those things before you get started, but like study a thing that will lead you to start a business, and then the rest will kind of fall into place around you.
Yeah, I think that really weaves in well with Naval's idea of just studying the fundamentals. If you have a solid base, if you have a steel foundation, then you can do whatever with it. So if you have, it's useful definitely to get your basic business literacy, right? Understand accounting and financial statements, understand the buzzwords in marketing, finance, whatever else. So at least you can form the concepts together in your head. And I think a book that does a really great job of that is like The Personal MBA. It's okay, now you have the entire glossary of business terms, and then you can apply a more just-in-time based learning as you realize I need to learn X aspect of business. It also is kind of big on, learnable versus teachable skills, where if you're learning business management in school, you're going to learn a lot of theory about business management. Whereas if you're learning accounting in school, you're actually going to be prepared to be an accountant. Whereas management's more learnable, where you actually have to be managing people. So I think there's a lot of, I get so into all these topics. So just loving this conversation. But one thing I really personally want to ask you about that I've struggled a lot with, even right before this call, is a personal hourly rate. That's something Naval, one of the most actionable, I think, like the few things that you come away from this book, like with a to-do list in hand, like, okay, this is a clear action item. And it's one I've really struggled with, something like outsourcing podcasting editing, right? I'm like, okay, I found one that will do it for, $40 an episode. And a $20 hourly rate is certainly not aggressive, but I'm also not ready to just pony up and all of a sudden, increase my monthly burn rate by $160. So how do you reconcile with setting and staying accountable to an ambitious number that you don't quite earn yet? And how does this interact with Naval's idea of avoiding lifestyle creep as well?
Yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question and a kind of a common one, because it's a very easy mental exercise to be like, oh yeah, totally. But if you go try to do it, like there's obvious roadblocks. And so the exercise that I would maybe walk you through is like, if you spent that 160 tomorrow to get that podcast editing time back, so you've got 8 more hours, but you've got $160 more out the door every month. Like, what would you do with those 8 hours?
I would focus on marketing. So like creative marketing strategies for the podcast. So I've been reading Traction, by Gabriel. I gotta cheat.
Yeah.
Gabriel Weinberg and Justin Mayers. Yep. And I think, spending 2 hours, whether it's reaching out to bloggers who write listicles about podcasts and trying to get features in those categories, or creating more content, instead of editing just the basic podcast, making more snippet content, or writing, I don't know, just something that's more high level cognitive and strategic.
Sure. So what would the result of you spending 8 hours on increased marketing effort be?
Assuming Kyle and I get a bottom of funnel in place, hopefully revenue.
Okay. Like, would that happen sooner if you were able to dedicate that time to it?
Absolutely.
Okay. And what's the blocker? And what's the blocker to revenue?
Audience.
Well, all the 3 pieces of the kind of digital marketing ecosystem: a large amount of traffic, and then a bottom end offer. We don't have a bottom end offer yet. We're not selling anything at this point, unless basically we need an audience to drive all of those things. It's kind of the critical next bottleneck to have a substantial audience size.
So you are currently not working on the bottleneck because you're doing your own podcast editing for $160 a month. But if you paid the $160 a month, you'd be able to spend the time on the audience, and the audience growth would determine the revenue, and the revenue would probably be greater than $160 a month. And it might take 2 to 6 months for that investment to pay back. but a 6-month investment payback period is insanely good and a no-brainer if you look at it that way, instead of I'm spending $160 and never getting it back. And so I think the other piece of that is looking at the whole channel of like what you would do to get that time back. The other maybe thing that makes that more approachable is that you're not making that a permanent decision, so it is hard to think of $160 a month forever as like that's just an intimidating thing. But if you say, I'm going to do this for 3 months or even one, like I'm not going to commit now, it's a fixed amount of money that you're spending, not a permanent change in that money, like going out the door. So I think like maybe put a stopgap on that and say, we're going to do it for 1 month. We're going to do it for 3 months. And we're going to see if that investment justifies itself, because you do have to use the time at a higher leverage way. Like you can't just tell yourself that your time is worth $100 an hour and then do jack shit with that time, unless you've already like got the leverage in place that is paying you back for it. But currently, I think, from everything I've heard from you guys and seen so far, like that time would be immediately better invested. And that would help you kind of start that flywheel of increased audience, increased productization, increased revenue. But all you're doing every month is delaying that. And when you look at the fact that you're delaying starting to build revenue every month, would you pay $160 to start that clock and that process sooner? Like probably. I think there's a lot of value in this. I think, you guys are doing an amazing podcast, doing an amazing job. You have great guests. Like the sooner you can start those processes that are going to build leverage and going to pay back and going to compound. So like, not only is it costing you the $160 a month
back to
of your own time, but you're also losing the time of compounding each month that you don't make that decision and start that investment.
Yeah, and I think contextualizing it as an experiment is kind of something that Lewis and I have tried to do with the podcast up until this point. Like we started and we were like, okay, we want to put out 25 episodes, then we'll reevaluate like whether or not this is valuable, whether or not it was a good experience. So I think deciding on that stopgap for a month or 2 months where we put the money up front and think that money's gone, now what are we going to do is the right way to move forward on that for sure.
Yeah. And there's probably smaller places to start with applying the leverage and buying back your time. If that one is too big of a leap, maybe there's a SaaS tool that's $10 a month that'll save you a half an hour. And like, that's worth it. And maybe there's an automation that if you spend 2 hours setting up, that'll save you an hour a week. And so there's things like that are maybe easier to chip away at, that you can kind of level up your way into the editing one. If that one still feels like big and scary and like, risky, I guess.
The way that you responded to his question, it felt like it was very informed by Naval, like in a way. And, I've heard you talk before about how this has changed your brain and made you think different just because you've distilled a million words of information from this guy and, that affects you. So like, my question is, what daily habits or what about you has changed to the process of putting this book together?
Yeah, it's hard to pin it all down. Having spent like 3 years kind of stewing in this material, I'm sure that I have adopted plenty of things as my own that I should be attributing to Naval. And I could probably quote him a very annoying number of times each month. But we are all like kind of standing on the shoulders of layers of giants that have come before us. And, there's one of my favorite sections in the book is Naval's recommended reading. And so if you go read some of the things that he has recommended, you can see where a lot of his ideas come from and the giants that he stands on. And so we're all kind of synthesizing ideas. I went through a phase of doing this with Munger kind of earlier in life and Benjamin Franklin based on his recommendation, and now Naval on top of that. And so, we're all just kind of, we are building ourselves based on who we choose to emulate and whose ideas we choose to let in. And the thing that I liked about spending the last few years kind of studying Naval's ideas is a mix of things that are important to me at the time. So, I have been in chapters of like extreme ambition and hard work and just really, really dedicated to building wealth and found myself in a very unhappy place. I was just not living a balanced life, wasn't super health focused. And one of the things that attracted me to Naval was that he's now kind of he's looking at life as in a holistic way, and saying, here are very straightforward principles to building wealth, but also here are the trade-offs that come with it. And here are complementary ideas about your health and your happiness and how it all fits together. And that kind of met me where I was in life at the moment. And maybe kind of pulled me into philosophy a little bit earlier in life than is like the natural pattern for people, that I'm kind of very grateful for. And so I've got habits from that section, and a little bit of a different perspective on how the world works and how wealth is built and how companies are built, and what makes people happy and what doesn't. And building healthy habits, like all of those things some of them were opinions that I had that were reinforced. And some of them I kind of see like new lenses almost. Leverage in particular is like a new lens. Accountability is maybe an improved understanding of the relationship between risk and reward. So there's some of those that are just kind of like new layers of understanding. Some feel kind of like new lenses on the world. And some just kind of feel like new habits, new ideas, new monikers, new mantras that just kind of sit with me or bubble up, as I have the little like Naval on my shoulder reminding me of things.
That's a huge network of mental hooks, kind of what Naval says the purpose of his writing is, right? And I think I really liked how something that really clicked for me just at the beginning of your explanation there was about that Naval's recommended reading, and how, we kind of have, at least in my head, contextualized him as this very powerful intellectual figure. And just when you're like, well, all Naval is just the accumulation of, his experience and this large, very large and very impressive glossary of books that he's read, Ben Franklin, and I can't remember the other ones off the top. Richard, so much Feynman, like a ton of Feynman, and it's just Naval's just the accumulation of all of that. And it's, for clarity's sake and for making it good writing, you don't say in the footnotes, this is the original book that this idea came from, and this came from this, and this came from this. And Naval really does an amazing job of presenting himself as, this, not necessarily intentionally, just as this original philosopher, and that kind of makes him intimidating as a figure. But totally that recommended reading, that could almost be an interesting way to experience the book if you put that at the beginning, just like read this and you won't be as intimidated by him. And then just, this is what one man did with all of these ideas. And obviously that can go forever down to the very beginning of thought and, modern thinking. But
yeah, absolutely. I think it's easier to see.
I got lost in the bibliography.
No, yeah, turtles all the way down. Like exactly. we're all. It's easier to see it in other people than in ourselves, I think. But like when we choose our inputs, however deliberately we do it, we are choosing who we become. And so to see someone else say like, "Hey, here are all my most influential books, and here's a book of all my ideas," it is much clearer than we will ever have a view of ourselves as a system of inputs and outputs, right? But like Naval's favorite books are all sci-fi, nonfiction, science, and philosophy. And so here's this guy who's like happy, immersed in the technology world, and kind of like first principles science influence, but not a scientist. So applied scientists interested in futurism, also kind of philosophically present and happy. And like those inputs determine those outputs. And of course that like started that kind of co-evolutionary cycle started with his interests. That's what drove him to choose what to read. But that became who he is. And so that like process just happens over and over and over again. And we are all going through it. And so whether, whatever the next thing is we choose to pick up is going to determine the next thing that we choose to pick up. It's going to determine the next thing we choose to pick up. And that over time is just going to like pile up into who we become. And each of one of those individual decisions might be very intentional. It might be very mindless. But, I ended up writing this book because I picked up Poor Charlie's Almanack and Seeking Wisdom and the Letters of Warren Buffett and Principles. And to what extent, like some of those decisions led into each other. Now I'm creating this book, and now this book is going to influence and certainly impact like whatever I do to create next in my life. And each one of those decisions is like not a huge monumental like pro con list staring out the window with a glass of scotch life decision, but it was like something that determined kind of how the path of my life, evolved and meandered. And we're all kind of making those decisions constantly.
And I mean, not to get too meta, but you can really extrapolate that out so far to where like if for the books thing, it's like if your mom had turned right instead of left that day, you walk into the house a little bit different, you miss that book. Or, my grandparents, like the butterfly effect in the world, you just have no idea what's going to happen with any action that you take. So I think, the quality, deciding on your inputs and the quality of those inputs does affect who you are. But at the same time, there's so many variables in every piece of who you are that like it's just mind boggling. What are the odds that we're here right now talking to each other? You know what I mean? It's like, it's insane. But to move on here, my next question for you is there any big area or idea that you disagree with Naval on? I think you've been asked this before, but I'm interested to hear again.
Yeah, I Pomp asked me this question and I hadn't thought hard about it before. And I think my first answer was that I didn't know, but I was very curious how his philosophy applied to his, how strictly he applied some of his like stoic philosophies to his very close relationships, his parents, his wife, his kids. And I think the other, which is a thing I stand by, that I'm just curious about, but I don't know how, I don't know enough to know that I disagree with it. And it wouldn't matter if I did, because those are very personal decisions and very personal kind of things. And if they work for him, they work for him. And that's wonderful. And I'm, perfectly entitled to choose my own way of life. The other one is that I think his philosophy on operating startups is kind of radical. So it is hard to agree with in its entirety. But I immediately told myself to shut the hell up, because he's built an incredibly successful like business or 5 and I haven't. So, easy for me to say I disagree with it when he's got a result and a track record and I don't.
Will you outline that just a little bit for our audience?
Yeah, he's, it's a pretty kind of free flowing. He really prioritizes like shipping fast and building like a very flexible, super independent team. And I think there are definitely like trade-offs, and I think he understands the trade-offs that he's making on that perfectly well. Like he sets like a very light long-term vision and says like, okay, you're in here, sit out and like ship every single day. Like nothing else matters. Just like ship an improvement every day. And the trade-offs to that are like kind of lack of product focus. Maybe sometimes there are like loose ends all over the product, and there are like maybe not a super cohesive experience, and you kind of have all these like half-hearted explorations that people undertake, but then trim. And so the upside of that is like you run a lot of experiments because you have a lot of different perspectives that are making their own individual decisions. And the downsides are maybe that like it's not as clear to users what, the focus of the product is. And maybe there's some effort wasted in that, but maybe it's made up in speed. And every entrepreneur has their own kind of operating philosophy, and he's just like extreme enough that it's maybe easy to kind of pick that out as a thing that's like, well, that's like far out there. But again, it has worked for him and it's worked for AngelList. So my disagreement doesn't mean much.
Well, I think, that idea of operating philosophy could be ran through that same analysis, kind of did at the beginning about specific knowledge, where you have to choose an operating philosophy that is a good match for your intuitive, natural inclinations to work. If you're super, you're the visionary, you're going to have a very different ideal working situation, an ideal iteration cycle and iteration strategy than someone who is, a habitual tinkerer and gets a ton of pleasure out of coming in to their workshop and putting a 1% improvement out every single day versus, someone like me who's like can get super excited about any new idea quickly and then reach the advanced beginner stage and then immediately want to just learn about a completely new domain. And so Naval, it seems like he's following his own advice there on, okay, well, that's the operational philosophy that works well for someone who has that first principles type, move fast, impatience attitude versus someone with a different approach is going to kind of take a different approach. And there's not anything wrong or incorrect about it. And I think that's really one of the best pieces of this book and this whole content platform and brand that Naval's created is at the end of his How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky, the podcast he does with Nivi, the 3-hour compilation of it all. He talks about, how he doesn't really feel like these are very attackable ideas because he only presents the absolute most distilled, absolute minimum viable principle, which I thought was a really cool concept, the minimum viable principle. This is just the baseline, not making any extrapolations, not taking any creative direction. This is just the absolute bare minimum. These are ways the world works. Apply this because it works. Like, trust me. Like, there's no arguments to be made against that. So one thing I want to ask you, because obviously we can't, you distilled 1 million words into a couple 100-page book. We're distilling a couple 100-page book into a podcast, which we'll put a title on and everything else. But the way Naval describes the whole distillation of the main message of this whole idea, at least on the wealth creation side, is productize yourself. How does that manage to encapsulate the most important ideas? And how does that serve as a hook that can be expanded on to kind of realize the rest of his ideas?
Yeah, this one kind of took me a while to feel confident unpacking because it is such a strong distillation. I mean, all the way, hundreds of pages down to 2 words. I actually think it's easier to start with yourself. And so yourself, it kind of embodies the concepts of specific knowledge. So knowing who you are, knowing what you're skilled at, knowing what you're obsessed with, leaning into those advantages, being accountable. So not trying to abstract yourself too much from what you're doing, not just in a skill sense, but in a like risk and accepting the risk that you're taking sense. So that is kind of yourself. On the productized side, it is really about leverage and about scale and kind of applying those to make it so that you don't have like a 1-for-1 input to output ratio. So yourself alone could be like a service business or a consulting or something like that. And productize really pushes you to do something that you can build once, sell twice, sell 100 times, something that has kind of leverage built into it. So whether that's through a podcast, whether that's through a book, whether that's through software or media or anything, or it's even through a trading algorithm, right? Like I think, there are plenty of things that fall into this category. So productize yourself is that kind of 2-word summary of like, find some leverage, find some scale, find something that society doesn't yet know how to get, but wants from you. And then yourself is like, take accountability for your own actions, do something that is inherent within you. So that doesn't summarize like all of the ideas of the wealth creation, but it is certainly some of the really kind of key ones that you can unpack from, just a 2-word mantra that you can use to kind of check in on what you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I read that at first, I didn't really understand it either.
Yeah.
It's kind of becoming clear to me, even hearing you say that just now. But I think that now we're going to transition to kind of what we call a bonus round, a little bit more about you, a little bit less thematic. But the first question that I have for you kind of piggies off something that I heard in Pom's podcast with you is you talk a lot about learning in public there. But one thing that I've been afraid of with this podcast and am still afraid of moving to the future is being wrong in public as a result of learning in public. So how have you dealt with being wrong in public?
I've never been wrong in public.
No mistakes. We tell the person, we basically find our editor and make sure that they know to remove any mistakes. We need an editor and a fact checker.
Fact check it all.
Yeah.
I'm very glad you guys started laughing immediately. This was clearly a joke. I'm wrong in public often. And usually I don't know, I find it helpful to like, you have a Twitter following over a certain size. Like if you tweet anything at all, people will try to correct you. And they often succeed, right? Like I've learned a lot by people clearly are more credentialed or experienced in a certain area coming up and being like, dude, you're super wrong. And usually it is about something that I like am glad to be informed on. Like the reason that I talk about this stuff in public and work in public is because I want to learn more about it. And I've found that the more you share about what you're interested in, the more people kind of show up to help you along. And so, especially on things that I don't know a lot about or I'm just starting off on, like I don't get a lot of ego wrapped up in that. And so being wrong in public or I think it's less about like right and wrong and more about like I'm a learner of a thing, and we are all learning something as we go. Like, we are never fully baked. And so, nutrition is something that, like, I'm interested in. I know more about than some people, but like, there are definitely a lot of experts that know a lot more about it than me. But when I talk about it, people correct me or add nuance or add, kind of additional information that pile on. And sometimes it contradicts, and I'm glad to be corrected and know. And sometimes, that's how I like fold that into myself and keep learning and growing. One of the things that, we have to kind of run those experiments in order to find out when we're wrong. And I think it's good for you to build up that, like, that muscle. Like, if you are too afraid to be wrong or incomplete or imperfect in public, then you're not going to get the benefits of building in public, because you just can't get over that ability to share. And, there are pros and cons to it, and just difficult to do. And, but if you have like some humility about it, like, I know what I'm not good at, and I know what I'm at least better than decent at. And so I'm not afraid to get corrected on things that I know that I don't know. And just kind of embracing that and getting, never taking yourself too seriously, so that, people correct you, people make fun of you. Like, it's whatever. Like, I know I suck at that. There's no problem. I can recognize that. And so especially on Twitter, like, I try to always be having fun with whatever I'm doing and never take it or myself too seriously. And, even this book, like, as much as I can, like, on the one hand, it's kind of representing Naval. And so I try to like take that piece very seriously. But I'm not afraid to like poke fun at myself and make jokes and make it fun and like take shit for it. Like, this part of the process. It's how I am in real life. It's how I am on the internet. Like, there's no reason to kind of posture and try to set up this unassailable, correctness in your social media. It's just hanging out at scale.
Yeah, I like that. I think a really funny example you brought up there about nutritional learning in public. I'm probably the case study number one for making bold, contradictory opinions about nutrition in public. I had a blog about veganism for a couple years. I put all these blogs, passionate about veganism. And now it's like a few last podcast we recorded, our guest asked us just like, what's an amazing customer service experience? And I just go, ButcherBox. Like, I love ButcherBox. I mean, taking a complete 180 on my nutritional stances in public. Like, the biggest fan of carnivore, really is probably his biggest fan. And, I could end up going vegan again the next day, so there's nothing wrong with changing your opinions on these things if you approach it with a level of humility and kind of acknowledge, we're all just figuring it out.
Yeah, especially in nutrition, surprisingly. Like,
yeah.
I don't know why that's much more of a religious question than a science question, but it seems to be. And that's partly what makes it fascinating, I think.
I mean, Naval gives us a good heuristic there. The older the problem, the older the solution, or the older the question, the older the answer. And nutrition is, ever since we've been able to have abundance and choice in nutrition, which is reasonably far enough ago, if we had the choice of 2 animals to hunt or 2 plants to gather, people probably started arguing about what was better and what was optimal.
Yeah.
But it seems like you have made your decision, and that's sandwiches. You love sandwiches a lot. You got some really good photos of sandwiches on your website. So what's your favorite sandwich, and what are the key components to making just a great sandwich?
And where does this passion for sandwich come from? That's where the why as well. Kyle asked the what, I need the why.
I think sandwiches are like pretty damn near universal. Like, every city has a sandwich that they're super proud of, and every country has like something between bread that is like sandwich or sandwich adjacent that like you can get into. It's just like, I don't know. It's somewhere between like universal but incredibly unique to like whatever locality you're in. So I think like, I spent quite a while in San Francisco and lived there for a bit. So like Molinari Deli, like the old school like Italian deli, is like pretty close to unbeatable. New Orleans has some amazing sandwiches like Cochon Butcher and Killer Po' Boys and stuff is incredible. There's some amazing barbecue sandwiches here in Kansas City. The Z-Man at Joe's, and you can go on and on. I think like, as long as you have like contrast in a sandwich, like you're pretty good. So you want like, fatty salami and acidic kind of crispy, like shredded lettuce and like juicy tomato, and like it's all about, or like crispy fried chicken that is spicy, and like creamy slaw that is crunchy at like Hattie B's in Nashville. So whatever, as long as you're kind of like finding contrast and you got some like salt, fat, acid, heat, like the kind of standard like flavor profile things, like you're golden. And it's funny when you start, like you see this huge variety of sandwiches, but they also, like the very, very best ones come back to like a few of those principles, right? Like salty, fatty, acid, like even really, really simple stuff have like those three components that in contrast, especially in a contrast in texture, like just is perfect.
So what would your favorite international sandwich be? Is it like a banh mi or like a Italian, like a crepe? I don't know if a sandwich is just carbs wrapped around. Definitions here.
I love a banh mi. I get in many fights about my definition of a sandwich, because I think like basically anything where like you're using a carb to eat the other stuff is a sandwich. So like I think tacos are a sandwich, like a hot dog's a sandwich, and you're gonna get hate mail. You're gonna get hate mail for that. I'm absolutely certain of it, but I stand by it, and it's fun bullshit to debate.
Okay. To switch directions back from sandwiches to books and thinking, as much as, because Kyle and I are going to a sandwich shop after this. That's on the calendar. But
what does Alabama know about sandwiches?
A lot. They actually, I'll take this one, Liz.
Yeah, I should not be answering this.
They got some really good barbecue sandwiches down here. Like,
okay.
I would say, oh man, I'm going to forget the name of the place and you put me on the spot, but when Miss Myra's in Vestavia, it's a little hole in the wall. They've got the best barbecue sandwich out there, for real. And when you come to Alabama, I'll take you there. No worries.
That's awesome. I love it. Thank you for not letting the vegan answer the sandwich question.
Yeah.
Hey, reformed, changed. I don't know where I'm at right now. My new butcher box is coming in, my second delivery. I mean, I did the same thing, right? Back to the outsourcing. I'm the most ridiculous person in the world when I'm afraid to spend $160 on editing, but I did spend $120 on a meat box. And it's a quality input. So, I mean, there's some lessons to be learned here. But I wrote this question before the show, and I had to add to it throughout the conversation to ensure we got an original answer. So I have a long list here. Besides Naval, Taleb, Munger, Dalio, and Buffett, who are some living thinkers we should be paying attention to?
Living. I think Peter Kaufman is like very underrated, and like he tries to stay under the radar. But he is an incredible, he is like a friend of Munger's and tries to distill like many of his lessons. And so he has really pushed some of the mental model stuff. Blas Moros is publishing a site called Lattice Work that is actually like covers a lot of Kaufman's ideas. Shane Parrish at Farnham Street has used a lot of Kaufman's ideas. And Shane is an incredible like thinker in his own right and distiller. Like I love Farnham Street, and Farnham Street was totally, like I found it when I was 22, and it's been like absolutely instrumental to like loading a lot of his mental models kind of in my head, and it's an incredible community. I think I wish I had my bookshelf in here because I could just go down that. Living thinkers. It's hard. You got to go through the Lindy effect of living. So like old enough to be like kind of proven and have a bunch of stuff out there, but not so like early and young in their career. I really love Alain de Botton, actually. I don't know if you guys have read any of his stuff. He's a British, I think he would call himself a philosopher, and he started by writing books that were like kind of modernizations of, his first book was How Proust Can Change Your Life. And I actually didn't really like that book at all, but some of his recent ones are more recent, are Status Anxiety. And he's written The School of Life. He's written about the news. He's written about The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work is another book by him. And it's a really kind of, it's kind of a similar ethos of like, let's look for timeless answers to modern problems in philosophy. And so, he looks at like the history of work and the history of status and the history of the news. through a lens of philosophy, and the work he's done at the School of Life is really incredible, because it takes through a lot of the like emotional wisdom that we are never taught in school, or even particularly like taught through our families necessarily. Each family kind of has their own set of like emotional knowledge and wisdom to pass on, but it's not, probably no family has a complete set of that. And he has really at the School of Life done a lot to kind of compile that, of like, here's how to make a study of relationships. Here's how to make a study of love. Here's how to make a study of friendship. Here's how to like kind of unpack some of those things that are timeless human problems, but they're like a little affected by modernity, or just like really difficult to kind of build your own assemblage of. And so, it's almost a curation of philosophy brought into modern time that he's done. He's got a few TED Talks. He's got a lot of books. The website, the School of Life, is free, and you can kind of go click around and read on that. But he's someone I think really, like, as a living thinker who is using timeless ideas, is really, really talented.
Yeah. And I think kind of on that note, like a lot of these up and coming people, you've been on their podcast here very recently, like Pomp, I think he'll be somebody. Like the way I look at it is something Lewis described as like the newsletter gang. Lewis, you want to fill in some of those names? I'm kind of missing a lot of them.
I just think that the people, so
just
people like
the names,
the Morning Brew crew, just the big productivity, entrepreneurship, marketing Twitter that also has a huge newsletter following.
I think they'll be like the lost generation of these 20s. There was like Hemingway and all them in Paris and the last 20s. And I think that some of those people that you've been talking to will prove to live up to something like that in the future.
There's an incredible, like Jack Butcher, David Perel, Tiago Forte, Trevor McKendrick, like these guys are all incredibly talented. They're brilliant people. Shane Parrish, like James Clear, Brent Beshore, like they are all doing like remarkable things, like whether it's through a newsletter or through books or through the blog or through like courses. I think like we have a lot to, like, as soon as our formal education stops, these are a lot of places that we turn. So like, how do we keep improving? How do we keep learning? How do we keep growing? And how do we find like more practical, like just in time solutions to the things that we're encountering, like in our personal and professional lives all the time? I think that's like, there's a lot of interesting stuff that I'm really excited to see the next 10 years and the next, and even, kind of what goes past that.
I think all of those guys command like a really great hold on Naval's principles, where, they have leverage in the form of humongous audiences, the relevancy and the character traits that they've built for themselves, the reputation of consistency and being, a thought leader on XYZ topic. They're going to have that intellectual gravity where the best opportunities are going to flow to them. And again, they're going to start to enjoy the winner take all prizes in their different games. And I think that's why, they're poising themselves to be in maybe a smaller scale or maybe a different scale, like a PayPal mafia of the next 10 years. That was my thesis of that original tweet that Kyle was referencing, and the Lewis's how to become a PayPal mafia using an email list, I guess. Tweet.
Yeah. I think increasingly of what's happening is like companies are having to become like, the lines between media and marketing are really blurring. Because media is becoming so free and so quality that in order to command any attention whatsoever, you can't really just be a marketing engine anymore. You have to create media. And in order to create media, like you have to compete with media companies. And so what's happening is like media companies, people who are good at building audiences and good at capturing attention, are now kind of like, you're starting with that and then building backwards into like, okay, how do I serve this audience? How do I solve their problems? How do I, deliver solutions to them? And that is like, just completely backwards than how, innovation has happened in the past. But I think it's a really, really interesting thing. And you're going to start to see like people with audiences start to make bigger and bigger bets sequentially. And they'll go from, newsletters to courses to SaaS tools to companies that are like, there's just more and more robust ways to solve problems that all of these people that I know have. And like, I'm just going to keep leveling up my investment in that and solving bigger and bigger problems, involving, more leverage, more accountability, more labor, more capital, more like, more products. And we're just going to kind of keep seeing that go.
I mean, Kyle and I have fully bought into that. We started this podcast with the general kind of direction of we don't necessarily know what we want to do. We know we want to be entrepreneurs. If we have an audience, any other problem we want to solve will be easier. And I think you give a good example there. Someone that I know helped you out with the book I saw in the acknowledgements that we're hopefully talking to in a couple of weeks is Taylor Pearson. And he, just grew an email list about productivity and crypto and finance and really, really great articles that dissect Taleb. And he's used that to become like a hedge fund manager. You know what I mean? Like that's a very
perfect example.
Yeah, that's a very uncommon though, like career trajectory. Like how many hedge fund managers became hedge fund managers because they established their credibility as just a blogger thinker about finance, and then all of a sudden I was like, let's actually give you money.
Probably. I think that describes Pomp, right? With Morgan Creek, or close to it. I think the O'Shaughnessy's like had a fund already, but it's certainly like grown tremendously as a result of the stuff that Patrick has done with Invest Like the Best, which is another amazing podcast kind of newsletter. Podcast. Yeah, it's really, really good. So I think that's I think we'll see more and more of those. Taylor Pearson's an incredible example and a great guy. Yeah, he helped me a ton with the book. He had a bestseller a few years ago, The End of Jobs. He's working on another one, which is very exciting.
Oh, he's working on it. That's exciting. I read The End of Jobs twice in 2 days, both times. So
that's a high compliment. Yeah.
I also read your book in 2 days, to be fair.
Yeah, that's good.
The turnaround time was pretty quick.
That's good. I want to be able to power through the end. The highest compliment you can get is people wishing it was longer. So that's what I was going for.
So next question here. What meditation habits do you have and how have you maintained those habits?
My meditation habits are not excellent. I would probably describe them as just in time. I do almost nothing proactively. But I have at least learned to recognize when I need to and learn to take that time. I also learned that sitting on a cushion with my legs crossed, it is harder for me to sustain as a habit. And this is somewhat hedonistic, but I've learned that hot tub time is basically meditation for me. So I go sit in the sauna and I get that experience of having meditated, of just being I can't do anything else. I'm just sitting here, I'm relaxing, thinking about, how good it feels to just kind of be weightless and listen to water flow. And that is as close to practiced, kind of normal meditation thing, but it solves the how do you silence that voice in your head? How do you just let things flow for me? And it's just kind of a process of experiment of finding when do you observe mental peace? And for me, that's kind of where it happened. And so now that I know that, I know where to kind of fit that into my routine and use that as a touchstone to go back to.
I like that. I've kind of come to a similar conclusion recently, where if I can just attach meditation to an existing habit, instead of meditate, I can just run with no entertainment instead of, podcasts, audiobooks, whatever else. And that becomes a form of meditation. But Eric, thank you so much for this conversation. We really enjoyed chatting with you. It was super exciting. I saw the book on Product Hunt. I saw it on Twitter and I said, I want to talk to Eric. I want to hear the man behind the book. If people want to learn more about yourself and learn more about the book, I know it's free. So make sure to bring that up. You do not have to pay for this book, unlike many other books that you do have to pay for. You don't have to pay for this one if you want to read it. But Eric, where should we send people who liked this conversation and want to learn more about yourself or Naval?
Yeah, the book and in its entirety and everything about it is on navalmanack.com. And I'm on Twitter, probably first and foremost, just at Eric Jorgensen, my full name. I got a personal website at ejorgensen.com with a little bit of random writing stuff here and there. But I'm easy to find, email, DM, whatever. Happy to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This is great, guys. I like it.
And that wraps up our conversation with Eric. It's obvious that through his intense study of Naval, a lot of the wisdom has distilled into him, which is something that he talks about and something that I found really interesting. And that's that, Naval was influenced by what came before him. And that's obvious through the recommended reading at the end of the book. And I thought this was a really interesting conversation and valuable for us in the context of this podcast. And I'm really excited for people to listen to it. What about you, Lewis?
Yeah, I jot down a few notes here, things I found interesting and worth recalling from the conversation. I think the way he helped us characterize some of the decisions we're making as kind of using the same terminology and mental frameworks as investing if we can invest $300 today and the payoff in 6 months is XYZ, that's probably a good return on investment rather than looking at it as I'm accruing more expenses for life. And I think that was really helpful. And I think that could be helpful for a lot of people experimenting with adding a certain project to their portfolio or adding a certain software tool to, their set of tools, is, confining it to be a well-defined experiment and seeing if that is worth your time and if it's a good decision. I also think the importance of taking time to reflect on, your specific knowledge, the way that is found is by, I think, a combination of journaling. So, asking yourself every day, what things did I do today that came easy to me? Asking the people around you, your mom, your closest friends, what are things I'm good at that most people aren't good at naturally? What feels like play to me that looks like work to others? And for me, that looks like writing. It looks like making this podcast. It looks like cold outreach. And those are only things I've started to discover because I've been thinking about it. A lot of people, you ask them what they want to do with their life and they kind of laugh it off and say, I have no idea. And I don't really think that's all that great. I think it's not something you should kind of have that passive, casual, humorous, ironic attitude towards. Instead, you should probably tackle the question, face the dragon, and be like, what am I good at? And take some time every day, every couple of days to reflect on what went well and what didn't go well and what you enjoyed and what you didn't like. And from that, you'll start to learn patterns about yourself. And I think that's the best way to get specific knowledge. Third thing here is, build on those who came before you, right? Eric, that's kind of what you were just talking about, Kyle, how Naval built on, let's look at, where's Genius on my bookshelf? He built on Richard Feynman so much. He built on Stoicism. He built on Buddhism. There's absolutely nothing wrong, and there's no pressure to be quote unquote original. We're all building on the ideas that came before us. We're all just building new knowledge on top of the knowledge that already exists. On a related note, number 4, distillation and curation is a form of value production, both intrinsically and extrinsically. So like you're saying, right, Eric, intrinsically from writing on his blog, that's how he learned about business, right? He didn't learn about business by reading business books. He learned about it by, I'm going to put out this blog about business. And in that process, I'm forcing myself to learn about it by writing. And then this book, obviously the extrinsic value, the value to the world is, there are a million readers of that blog. There are hundreds of readers of this book, probably thousands at this point, people that are really getting value from it. So he learned a lot by doing it, and he produced value for other people just by making someone else's ideas more digestible. And the last thing here for me is repetition is the mother of all learning. I got that from listening to a Russell Brunson podcast I had listened to in between recording this podcast conversation initially and recording this follow-up now. But the idea for me, in preparation for this podcast, re-listened to the entire How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky podcast for Naval. I re-listened to some of his interviews like on Farnham Street. I read the entire book, which contained probably all ideas I've seen all before because I've listened to all of the resources that the book was built from. And it was most valuable because through the process of repetition, I'm ingraining the ideas better. I'm, the things that the first time I saw it, those now make sense to me already. And so those are reinforcing. And then I actually have the mental space to start absorbing some of the new ideas. So there's nothing wrong with rereading books, re-listening to podcasts. If you enjoy a piece of content and want to ingrain the ideas, the best way to do that is probably through repetition. That was a long-winded explanation of what I learned in this conversation, but it's an experiment. I liked it. So signing us off real quick, call to action for you listeners. Check out the book. It's free. It's totally free. Free on Kindle, free on PDF, free on EPUB. If you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter. It means that if you have an electronic device, you can view it for free and read it for free. You should try it. You don't have to read the whole book, skim through it, see if you like it, or just follow Naval on Twitter. He liked some of my tweets I posted after this podcast came out. That's pretty sick. Anyway, if you liked what you heard today and you want to stay up to date with the podcast, with the Lewis and Kyle Show, 3 ways you can do that. You can subscribe within your podcast player or on YouTube. Now we have an email list. That's number 2. You can get updates straight to your inbox. Number 3, we have social media accounts on all major platforms. You can get updates right in your feed. Last, if you want to help us out, 3 ways for you to do that as well. You can leave a rating and or review on iTunes. You can do word of mouth, good old fashioned. Hey, I'm at dinner. I like this podcast. I'm going to tell my friends about it. Number 3, you listen to this episode. That's a link. It's the internet. It's amazing. Just post the link on social media. Say, I like this podcast. Y'all should check it out. That's how you can help us out. Anyway, thanks for listening. If you made it this far, we really appreciate it. Have a great week. We'll see you in a week with the next episode. See ya.